Have you ever thought of how women were first introduced to the world of advertising as, unfortunately, an object? Do you believe that when you discover or create something really important, the entire world will love you for it? We all know that heroin and cocaine are extremely harmful, but did you know that one day they were included in many products and endorsed by some very reputable companies and people? Do you believe that one lie can really have devastating effects on the entire world? Is that even possible? Join me in this episode and we'll find out about these questions and more. This is your host, Danny, and this is the second episode of our series, Shocking Events That Made History. Now, before I start with our very first event, and that is Women in Advertising, I would like to invite you to visit my website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com, where you will enjoy the essence of English Plus. Because, yes, you will learn English with English Plus, but English Plus is much more than that. There are audio series, courses, daily reading and activity center, and much more. Take not only your English, but also your knowledge to the next level on EnglishPlusPodcast.com. And for those of you who want to take it even a step further, you can subscribe to our Lifelong Learners Clan on Patreon and unlock all the premium content on the website, such as premium series, ebooks, and online courses. Never stop learning with English Plus. You can find all the links you need in the description of the episode. And now, without further ado, let's start with the second episode of our series, Shocking Events That Made History. It wasn't always as we see it today, just like everywhere. But very few people alive remember when women's role, or actually getting exploited in the world of advertising, really began. For many people, it is a means to an end, but many others might share this view with me that there's still a long way to go in how females are portrayed in advertising. We're still not even close to portraying women as regular and just as normal human beings as the rest of the population. Is that shocking enough for you? It may be, but I hope it's not new, because then I will have to ask under which rock you've been hiding. But as shocking as it may be, it's still happening. But how did all that start? Let's find out. You've come a long way, baby. You can read that as part of the Virginia Slims ad campaign that launched on July the 22nd, 1968. The tagline that the Leo Burnett agency masterminded caught on almost instantly. The message was supposedly liberation and empowerment, with images of free-spirited women doing what they wanted in the world, often in contrast to dated black and white pictures in the same ads showing the restricted roles from which they were emerging. Women had undergone a transformation in ads, but it wasn't the revolution the Virginia Slims admin tried to convey. Progress was represented in one transition, from women depicted as helpless and housebound to women as sexual objects. For decades, ads had been patronizing in their representation of women. "Don't worry, darling, you didn't burn the beer," read the copy for an Old Schlitz ad, which featured a weeping housewife holding a charred and smoking frying pan while her husband embraced her. An ad for Del Monte ketchup in a bottle was even more condescending. It goes like, "You mean a woman can open it?" I'm sorry, I'm just saying that, and it really hurts when you say things like that, but these are actual ad campaigns. But as much as we all agree that this is degrading to women, well, the transition was not better. Ladies in ads soon ditched the aprons and nearly everything else. Sex sold. And thus began the trend of scantily clad women posing provocatively with everything from hamburgers to hot rods. The creative approaches are many, but one message is clear. There may still be a long way to go in how females are portrayed. So, that was our first shocking event for this episode. Our next shocking event has to do with the death of a king and how painful that can get. Stay with me, because that's what we're going to talk about next. Britain's King Charles II was supposed to die a little less painfully than he did. But being royalty and all in a time when modern medicine did not even make its debut, the king spent his last few days as a lab rat for the so-called medical experts of the day. Britain's King Charles II was known for his vigor, particularly in the bedroom. But on February the 2nd, 1685, the so-called Merry Monarch awoke, unable or unwilling to say a single word, his face pale as death, according to his groom. And so began an excruciating 5-day ordeal. After the king fell unconscious, a physician opened his veins and drained 16 ounces of blood. The king showed no improvement, so more medical experts were summoned. A frenzy of nearly 60 remedies was prescribed, including such potions as oriental bezoar stones from a goat's stomach and spirits of human skull. Some of the treatments were so toxic that they burned poor Charles's lips and tongue. Hot irons were applied to his head to draw out the bad humors. On February the 6th, he finally expired, but not before apologizing for being such a time a-dying. The cures no doubt prolonged his pain. And if modern medicine has its flaws, at least modern comforts accompany them. So that was our second shocking event in this episode that made history. And here, we're not talking about something that actually changed anything in history. We're just talking about things that made history, that are remembered as part of history, as shocking as they may be. Anyway, next we will talk about the next event that is very shocking, especially when we talk about the man who created the vaccine for polio. I mean, you would imagine that people would worship a man like that. But it's not exactly the case. That's what we're going to talk about next. Don't go away. We'll be back. Most of you must know that we have beaten polio in almost all the world. And that is indeed a big achievement if you think that in 1953, 35,000 new cases of polio were reported in the United States alone. So we must all be grateful today that we have one less thing to worry about, right? And think about it. What would you say to the man who made the vaccine that has been saving millions of lives ever since it was created? You would probably name the man a hero and consider him for some big medal or award or something like that, right? Well, even this man had no immunity from the critics. In 1953, the same year, 35,000 new cases of polio were reported in the United States. Salvation from the dread scourge seemed imminent. A young researcher named Jonas Salk had obtained some positive results from trials of a new vaccine, but it had yet to be perfected. So when Salk went on national radio on March the 26th, 1953 to share his findings, it was unclear whether he did it so to temper public expectations or to reap premature acclaim. Salk's fellow scientists believed the latter. Seething with professional jealousy, some claimed he was vying for celebrity status. Albert Sabin, Salk's rival in polio vaccine research, was particularly venomous, calling his work pure kitchen chemistry. Despite the continuing snubs of his peers, Salk was a miracle worker to the wider public, the face of a vaccine that would save countless lives. And now we'll talk about drugs. Of course, you know that drugs are bad. And of course, we're talking about illegal drugs here. Illegal drugs can destroy your lives. We see that every day. We know that. And definitely, we should stay away from drugs. But did you know that even drugs had their heyday? That's what we're going to talk about next. Don't go away. I'll be right back.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Looking to enhance your English skills while exploring a world of knowledge? Then English Plus Podcast website is just for you. Dive into diverse topics ranging from science to literature, history to business, and myths to modern insights. Each episode from our podcast or article from our magazine is a journey of learning and discovery, designed to not only improve your language skills, but also broaden your understanding of the world. Join us at English Plus Podcast, where language meets limitless learning. Tune in today and take your English to the next level. Visit EnglishPlusPodcast.com to start your journey. English Plus Podcast, language, learning, enlightenment. Never stop learning with English Plus. anyone about heroin and cocaine nowadays, and the answer is almost invariably the same. These drugs can and will destroy your life. It's almost always a one-way ticket in some dark world you will eventually struggle living in on your own, away from all the people you love. I know I'm being a little dramatic about it, but heroin and cocaine are that dangerous. I bet almost everyone who is listening to me right now agrees on this, but shockingly enough, that was not always the case. And even heroin had its own heyday. Heroin once found a welcome among consumers and physicians. Doctors touted the opium derivative as a non-addictive alternative to morphine and prescribed it for any number of ailments, especially as a cough remedy. No other drug can compare with heroin in this particular. And here I'm quoting what one physician declared in the February 22nd, 1900 edition of the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. So it was not just like somebody said it was okay. No, these were doctors. These were doctors who wrote in medical journals. They said that no other drug can compare with heroin in this particular. Here as a cough remedy, of course. Companies like Bayer, the very famous pharmaceutical company, hooked millions on their heroin-laced products. And though the ingredient was eventually removed, cough syrup with codeine, which is another opiate, is still sold over the counter in parts of the world. Cocaine, too, was once a mainstream ingredient that gave an extra jolt to some beverages at the end of the 19th century. And guess what? Even the Pope developed a taste for it in the form of an infused wine, Vin Marini, which he exalted as his favorite drink. So, shocking, right? But it's true, and it happened. And our next event is going to be about our DNA. And this great thing we know about nowadays was not received all that well at the beginning. There is a twist in the blueprint for life. That's coming next. Don't go away. I'll be right back. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Well, that's kind of smart, right? Well, I kind of practiced saying that, so I don't think I can say that again as fluently. But anyway, what does that stand for? It stands for the easy pronounceable DNA. DNA for short. Now, DNA has had many great uses since its discovery. We've been able to solve much more crimes than ever before. We've been able to understand and treat many diseases based on DNA research. And more importantly, we've come a step closer to understanding our own blueprints. And as much as this may lead to disasters when it is commercialized or even worse, weaponized, no one can deny the great impact the discovery of DNA has on many aspects of our lives. And you would probably cherish the people who made this great discovery. But the story of the blueprint for life is not without its own twists. On December the 11th, 1951, after a disastrous demonstration of what they thought was the model for the structure of DNA, Francis Crick and James D. Watson were ordered to cease their research by Sir Lawrence Bragg, director of Cambridge University's Cavendish Laboratory. No attempt was made to appeal the verdict, Watson later wrote. An open outcry would reveal that our professor was completely in the dark about what the initials DNA stood for. There was no reason to believe that he gave it 1/100th the importance of the structure of metals, for which he took great delight in making soap bubble models. End quote. Watson acknowledged that the partners' passive acceptance of the verdict was based on self-interest, not altruism. And here I quote, "Lying low made sense because we were up the creek with models based on sugar phosphate cores." End quote. Within a few years, however, the researchers resumed their work in DNA and soon arrived at a redeeming solution, cracking the code to the mystery of life. So even great stories do not happen without a twist. Even the DNA story, one of the greatest discoveries of modern time. But now we will talk about something else. We will talk about lies. We will talk about a chemist's lethal lie that plagues the world. That's coming next. Don't go away. I'll be right back. We all have our own lies. Well, some of us lie more than others. Some lies are more serious than others, but lies are lies after all, and we all tell lies now and then. However, this is not about judging the level or the impact of your lies, and mine, of course. I will tell you about a lethal lie that could have damaged the entire globe for good. And it might have done just that, but hopefully the world has figured out how bad these lies were and has taken action to correct the course. And this is about a chemist's lethal lie that plagues the world. Bill Bryson wrote in A Short History of Nearly Everything about this man. He said Thomas Midgley was an engineer by training, and the world would no doubt have been a safer place if he had stayed so. So who is this man, Thomas Midgley? Of course, Midgley had no way of knowing the hideous effect his incarnation as a chemist would eventually have on the planet when he discovered that lead added to gasoline solved engine knocks. But considering the performance he gave for the media on October the 30th, 1924, there's good indication that he wouldn't have cared. It would be another half-century before the detrimental impact of lead spewed from automobile exhaust pipes became a major environmental and public health concern. But by 1924, the media was already widely reporting the debilitating effects of poisonous lead on refinery workers, so Midgley came up with a stunt to appease them. Standing before a group of reporters at Standard Oil's headquarters in New York City, the scientist proceeded to pour a clear, thick liquid infused with lead over his arms. Then after drying himself, he inhaled deeply from a jar of the same liquid for a minute. Proof, he declared, that there was no danger associated with limited exposure to diluted lead, and that the dead and dying refinery workers had obviously not followed basic safety precautions. What Midgley neglected to mention was that just a year earlier, he had become gravely ill himself from lead poisoning and had to take 6 weeks off work as a result. But the irrepressible scientist returned better than ever with a brand new chemical refrigerant. Chlorofluorocarbons, those pesky little ozone chewers better known as CFCs. Thanks in part to his nifty invention, tons of ozone-depleting substances grew a hole in the atmosphere over decades before the Montreal Protocol of 1987 phased out the flow of CFCs heavily used in aerosols and refrigerators. Midgley would never know what his ingenuity had wrought. If we had just kept letting CFCs increase at a pretty nominal rate, the decreased ozone levels of the hole would have eventually covered the entire planet, said atmospheric physicist Paul Newman of NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Now a complete rebound seems imminent, and some scientists project that by 2080, global ozone will return to 1950s levels. As for Midgley, he didn't quite escape his own inventive legacy. He contracted polio at the age of 51, and after he lost the use of his legs, he devised a complex pulley and harness lifting mechanism to help him get into and out of bed. On November the 2nd, 1944, he became entangled in the mechanism and strangled himself to death. I'm not saying that I'm sorry, but let's not be naive and think that Midgley is the villain here. Well, the real villain are those companies who saw opportunity in what Midgley discovered, or at least in what this chemist introduced to the world. They saw commercial opportunity, they took it, and they exploited it to the most, and they didn't care at all about what that would do to our planet or to other people's lives, because these are the others. But anyway, let's not get into that. That's a long story. We talked about the chemist's lie that almost destroyed the world. And next, we're going to talk about Galileo, the day Galileo's world stood still. Stay with me. Don't go away. I'll be right back. You might have heard of Galileo, and you might have even heard of Copernicus, who came before him, who was attacked by religious authorities back in the day for saying that the Earth revolves around the sun and not vice versa. Well, Galileo believed the same thing, and the church back then was still not ready to change its mind. So this is about the day Galileo's world stood still. Having been broken by the Roman Inquisition after the publication of his masterpiece, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, which Pope Urban VIII believed made a mockery of him in the character of Simplicio, Galileo Galilei stood before his judges and abjured everything he believed about the order of the solar system. Galileo said, "I held, as I still hold, as most true and indisputable the opinion of Ptolemy, that is to say, the stability of the earth and the motion of the sun." Galileo's renunciation of Copernicanism on June the 21st, 1633 ended as follows. "I affirm, therefore, on my conscience that I do not now hold the condemned opinion that the sun stands motionless as earth revolves around it, and have not held it since the decision of authorities. I am here in your hands. Do with me what you please." For having been found vehemently suspect of heresy, the great astronomer would spend the rest of his life under house arrest. His work has long since been redeemed, and our understanding of the solar system continues to evolve with far more generous consideration of new theories. But unfortunately, although he set the course for many generations that came after him, his ideas were dangerous back then and were not welcome as they should have. And now we come to the very last event for today's episode, and something that has to do with rocket science. That's coming next. Don't go away. That'll be the last event in today's episode, the second episode of our series, Shocking Events That Made History. Stay tuned. Don't go away. I'll be right back. When you talk about rocket science, you're talking about some really difficult and complicated things that you can or cannot do. We all know that famous expression. It doesn't need a rocket scientist to figure that out, or many other expressions using rocket science in them. But rocket science is actually the science of rockets. In this last shocking event in today's episode, I'll demonstrate to you how ignorance and the lack of imagination can lead people to reject the very ideas that would shape the future. It has always been this way, and it will always be that. Men are afraid of what they don't understand. And although they claim that they have faith, they rarely believe in things they cannot see or touch. And unfortunately, it doesn't stop here. It usually goes on from deliberately ignoring those visionaries to attacking them and trying to defame them publicly. Because, my friends, it was rocket science after all. We know that the nature of genius is to provide idiots with ideas 20 years later. That is what French poet and novelist Louis Aragon wrote. Van Gogh was a failed, starving artist who sold only a couple of paintings before his death. People liked Bach's organ playing but largely ignored his compositions. Sometimes genius has actually been scorned. Robert H. Goddard was ridiculed when his pioneering ideas for space travel became public. On January the 13th, 1920, the New York Times published an editorial titled "A Severe Strain on Credulity," declaring that Goddard only seems to lack the basic scientific knowledge ladled out daily in high schools. Just 24 years after Goddard's death in 1945, man first walked on the moon, propelled there by the rocket technology that the derided physicist originated. The next day, the Times ran a correction, and it goes on saying, "Further investigation and experimentation have confirmed the findings of Isaac Newton in the 17th century, and it is now definitely established that a rocket can function in a vacuum as well as in an atmosphere." The Times regrets the error. So while I have to admit that it is not always intentional, but it happens, sometimes those geniuses are not even appreciated, not until after they die, even sometimes a long time after they die, unfortunately. But anyway, that was our last event in today's episode, our second episode in our series, Shocking Events That Made History. And every Wednesday, we're going to have a new episode from the same series. So stay tuned and come back next week. But it's not only about that. There is a lot of other content you can check out in English Plus Podcast. Remember, English Plus is not only about learning English. Of course, you can learn English. I will help you do that. But it is much more than that. It's about learning about many other things. So take your English and your knowledge to the next level with English Plus. And don't forget, go to my website, englishpluspodcast.com, for more opportunities. And also consider taking all this even a step further by subscribing to my lifelong learners on Patreon. And by this, you're supporting the show, but at the same time, you get great benefits like premium audio series, premium ebooks, and premium online courses, all you can find on the website. With that being said, I would like to thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus Podcast. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.